It's been a wonderful year, and I love working with you all, and I love hanging out with you all on Tuesday nights. So, welcome. This is the last of our series, Stages Along Life's Way, How We Become Who We Are. It's been an interesting series. It's always interesting for me. If you don't know, I'm learning along with you. I don't come in with these things canned. I have to figure them out myself, and then invariably, I learn more when we start talking about the issues. So I hope that'll be true tonight too. All right, enough of that. Let's get to the last talk in the series, from postmodernism to posthumanism, how we become who we are. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Here's where we've been. We began with rites of passage and went to the medicine wheel, and then we went through several theorists. And we'll do some theorists tonight, but it's a very different kind of approach, as you'll see. Postmodernism, what is it, right? Well, postmodernism is a product of the Romanticist rejection of reason and of the Western guilt regarding tragedies such as slavery, colonialism, the Holocaust, etc., many of which are viewed as consequences of Enlightenment imperialistic thought. A typical expression of this guilt is to display one's repentance regarding these historical events, even if one is not personally responsible for them, with political correctness being one of its social coercive tools. Here's another definition of postmodernism. All approximations of truth, science, as much as any fable or religion, are mere stories devised to serve people's needs or interests. Reality itself is a purely social construction, a tableau of useful or wishful myths that members of a society or tribe have been persuaded to believe. The borders between fiction and nonfiction are permeable, maybe non-existent. The delusions of the insane, superstitions, and magical thinking, any of those may be legitimate as the supposed truths contrived by Western reason and science. Believe whatever you want, because pretty much everything is equally true and false. Marcus Honeysett says 3 things lie at the core of the postmodern worldview: philosophical pluralism, relativism, and a kind of nihilism. There is no truth. And then just recently, there was this.
So, how did we get to this place where we're so fragile, the safe space people?
Well, I think that you can pretty much blame it on the universalists. I think that they pursued, especially in the humanities and in social science as well, they pursued a policy of a radical leftist policy with an overlay of postmodernism, which kind of a literary criticism approach that's produced all of this, as far as I can tell. I think you can lay a lot of it at the feet of faculties like the faculties of education. There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education this week just devastated the faculties of education, taking them to task for low academic standards and for possession by ideology and for basically indoctrinating people in a cult-like manner and playing identity politics and group identity.
The common element among all these definitions, including Jordan Peterson's, is that they are completely and utterly wrong. Absolutely wrong. They are incorrect. Let's get it correct tonight and then understand what we're dealing with. To do that, we need to set the stage. The Enlightenment, roughly 1637 to 1789. This is the height of human reason, that we became enlightened. What are the features of this age? Stable, coherent, knowable self. We've seen that in all our theories so far. There is a self. It is stable, it is coherent. Not only that, it goes through various stages. And we can pretty much nail down the stages, some of the theorists would say. Reason or rationality. This self, this stable, coherent self, knows itself and the world through reason or rationality. This is the highest form of mental functioning and the only objective truth. Science. This is the mode of knowing produced by the rational self that is the highest form of knowing. It can provide universal truths about the world regardless of the individual status of the knower. And that is the great virtue of science, is that it's objective, not subjective. So, and it's not designed to produce an outcome, it's designed to reveal an outcome. And so you're not working backwards from a premise, you're working from a conclusion, you're working toward one. The knowledge produced by science, and we might add certain kind of rationality, logic, etc., is truth, and it is eternal. It is the objective, absolute truth. This truth, produced by science, by the rational knowing self, remember, will always lead toward progress and perfection. All human institutions and practices can be analyzed and improved using this method. Freedom, 6, freedom. Reason is the ultimate judge of what is true and therefore of what is right and what is good, not to mention what is legal and what is ethical. And freedom, then, consists in obedience to the laws that conform to the knowledge discovered by reason. I think of Baruch Spinoza, who created an ethics based on geometry. Axiom 1, corollary 1, right? You want to know how to live? Look to geometry. 7, in a world governed by reason, the true will always be the same as the good and the right and the beautiful, by the way. There can be no conflict between what is true and what is right. Science, therefore, must be free to pursue its inquiries without political, religious, or any other cultural interference. Science is neutral and objective and must be free to follow the laws of reason, not money or power. And finally, language must be rational and transparent. Language is the mode of expression used in producing and disseminating this knowledge, and so it must be rational in itself. That means it must refer to reference, it must refer to things that are real in the perceivable world, which the rational mind observes. There must be a firm and objective connection between the objects of perception and the words used to name them. In other words, if I say cat, I must be referring to a real cat in the world if I'm doing science or rationality. After that comes modernism. Again, all these terms are very fluid and work differently in different disciplines, but this is a general map of how you get to postmodernism. Modernism, as you can see already, is a reaction against the Enlightenment mindset, worldview. Instead of objectivity, you have self-reflexivity. You turn inside. I've mentioned this a few times before because we have such a great example in modern British literature where after World War I, the nation gave birth to a literary movement called modernism that just looked inside. So you've got James Joyce doing stream of consciousness stuff in Ulysses, and you've got him doing whatever the hell it was he was doing in Finnegan's Wake, which may be the most unread book in the history of Western thought, because it may be unreadable, I don't know. When I was at Emory, there was a Finnegan's Wake reading group that had been going for 10 years, and they'd gotten to page 5. True story.
Just a quick question about
Yeah.
the dates.
Yeah, they're made up. They're not completely made up. They're just being marked by different things.
But for modernism, is that?
That's Descartes' Meditations, so 1637. And so, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, so that the locus of rationality and selfhood is in the mind, in the cogito. That's why it starts there. It ends with the French Revolution, because a lot of things ended with the French Revolution. Thank you for the question, though.
Wouldn't that be the beginning and end of enlightenment, though?
Enlightenment's within that, too. Yes.
With modernism, you're talking about World War I and Joyce, right?
That's right. I'm talking about literary modernism, yes. Sorry if this is confusing. Oh, yeah, that is the same. Well, yeah, okay. That may just be a typo on my part. I would take modernism to probably the 40s. Thank you for that. That's not right.
The Renaissance is in there, too.
Well, it's before the Enlightenment, yeah. But I didn't want to, right, I didn't want to get too far back, because, see, we're already lost because of my typo. And Picasso is designed to lose you anyway. Look at that. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'd put modernism into the 20s, definitely, and maybe even into the 40s, maybe even to the Second War. People put these dates everywhere. You could argue that modernism ends in the 60s, but let's not get bogged down in that. Because I think you know these movements yourself, kind of experientially. So self-reflexivity, stream of consciousness, Virginia Woolf to the Lighthouse, brilliant, wonderful work that is totally interior. It's about her mind and as her mind processes experiences. Sure, there are things happening, but the scene of the novel is really inside her mind. And it doesn't follow a narrative arc. It follows stream of just whatever comes into her mind, the narrator's mind. Alternate ways of thinking about representation, so Cubism, thank you, Picasso, which attempts to see the same event or object from multiple perspectives at the same time. Radical experimentation in form, breakdown of generic distinctions between poetry and prose, for example. Gertrude Stein, again, Virginia Woolf. Fragmentation in form and representation, Eliot's The Wasteland. These fragments I have shored up against my ruins, and just, you represent the fragmentation in the work. Extreme ambiguity and simultaneity in structure. Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, for example, which offers the same events from radically different focalized perspectives. Rashomon, you may be thinking of as an example too. Breakdown between high and low forms. This is going to become important, so that Eliot and Joyce use popular cultural material in their work, or they use folkloric material, right? That was unheard of. You would only use, basically you're retelling the stories of Homer in the classical and neoclassical periods, in the Renaissance, Charlie. Now you're going to use everything. You're going to become more of a bricoleur. You're going to take whatever's around you, and what's around you is popular culture. And so you get Eliot in the love song having the narrator say, "Do I dare eat a peach?" Right? That's not high art. That's Prufrock. That's embodying J. Alfred Prufrock and his difficulties navigating popular culture. And then, this is important too, the use of parody and irony. Ulysses is the story of the Odyssey, except it's not. It's not really like the Odyssey at all, but it's named for the main character, Ulysses. So it's a retelling, it's a parodic retelling, shot through with irony. All right. Postmodernism, yeah, there's my date, 1945. Thank you, Yango. So yes, postmodernism has an Oedipal relationship. I can say that now because we've talked about Freud. Has an Oedipal relationship to modernism. It was born from it, but it also wants to kill it. right? So the self-reflexivity in modernism becomes extreme in postmodernism. So for example, the Scream series of movies, right, has characters debating the rules of the horror film, right? That's extreme self-reflexivity. That would never happen in high art, right? Because high art is pointing outward. It's not turning inward. Irony and parody. This is a hallmark of postmodernism. Playfulness that comes with irony and parody. And you know this because we live with it every day. Umberto Eco, the great Italian literary critic and novelist, said the only way to speak seriously in the 20th century is with irony. A severe breakdown between high and low cultural forms. Again, Andy Warhol here, Rauschenberg, for example, with this pastiche, right, or the collages. You're not focusing on a single representation with elements. You're just throwing stuff together, right? Pastiche. You're layering on. Retro. Postmodernists and postmodern culture are fascinated with the past. I remember my very first doctoral seminar I had 3, and one of them was on postmodernism. And I thought I knew what it was. And so I remember the first day of class, this was a great moment for me because the professor said, well, postmodernism is an attempt to re-engage history, although ironically. And I said, what? Re-engage history? And he's like, yeah, where you been? And hadn't been anywhere, turns out. Hadn't been reading about postmodernism. Postmodernism is historic. It re-engages history. In fact, Linda Hutchin calls postmodern literature historiographic metafiction, meaning it rewrites history with a great deal of self-reflexivity. For example, in terms of self-reflexivity, if you don't know the writer Italo Calvino, you should. Fantastic writer. Invisible Cities, one of the great books of the world. He also wrote a book called If on a Winter's Night a Traveler that begins something like this. You're about to read If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. You should probably put your feet up, maybe make a cup of tea, tell people not to bother you while you're reading If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Intense self-reflexivity. Another postmodern novel is Julian Barnes' A History of the World in 10.5 chapters that literally retells the history of the world from Noah's Ark to heaven, but of course he can't do that, right? Except he does. Irony, parody, historiographic metafiction. Questioning of grand narratives. This is from Jean-Francois Lyotard, his book, The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge, where the real takeaway from the book is he defines, how's he put it? I think he says extremely simplistically or something like that, as incredulity toward meta-narratives. And that may sound odd and strange, but it's you and it's me, incredulity toward meta-narratives. Anybody who's trying to tell you something that explains the whole history of everything, I'm not buying it. It's that same feeling when we were going through the other theorists and they had these charts and graphs and, oh, well, this is how a human being develops. No, sorry, I don't even need to read the chart. That's a meta-narrative. That's a grand narrative, and I'm not buying it. We can talk about why later, but basically, grand narratives have screwed us in the past. Visuality and the simulacrum, image and representation. We're going to get into this more, so you probably don't. Every time I see the word simulacrum, I think it's milk, right? What is that called? Simulac? Yeah. I always think of milk when I think. We'll get into this more. Late capitalism. So this is Frederick Jameson. There's a sense that the world's been taken over in postmodernism by the values of capitalist acquisition, so that there are no longer any alternatives. In fact, there are no longer, or soon will be, no longer any resources. And capitalism runs on resources. That's why it's called late capitalism. It can't last much longer. And of course, advancements in technology only exacerbate this notion. Disorientation. I can remember my professor in graduate school, MTV was gaining a lot of popularity, and he's like, I don't get it, there's no narrative here. And we're like, so? And he was appalled that there was no narrative. But then I think you know that we live in a world and participate in forms of representation that you have to force a narrative on it. It's more a sense of spectacle, and we should reference G. Debord again here as Society of the Spectacle. Secondary orality, we talked about this before with Walter Ong and orality and literacy. This just means that there was speaking, there was writing, and now there's images that contain speaking and writing, right? So there's a secondary orality at work. All right. Now, yes. Oh, you like the treachery, the treason of images? That's one of my favorites too. Well, let's talk about that since people are laughing at it. This is Magritte, right? And the statement in French there is, this is not a pipe. Is it a pipe? Looks like a pipe to me. Exactly. It's not. It's a painting of a pipe. So is it a pipe? He says it's not a pipe. Welcome to postmodernism. So one of the things, in fact, I think the main thing that happens when people try to understand postmodernism, and I think it's cool that people want to understand it, is that it can mean so many different things, which is kind of interesting in itself. People use it to mean after modernism. So that sense in modernism that we talked about of turning inward, this is what happens after you turn inward, is you have to kind of turn back outward. Well, what do you do when you've turned inward and you've written something like Finnegan's Wake and you turn back out? What are you going to work with? Well, you're not going back. You're not going back to realistic fiction. You're not going back to Victorian fiction. You can't go back. And so the only way is forward. And what does that look like? Well, you have to recombine things. You have to put things together in a new way. That's what postmodernism does. And so that's why it re-engages with history. Modernism tried to break with history and just kind of turn away from history, and there was a lot to turn away from. And now postmodernism is, well, we've got to do history. Let's have some fun with it, right? So it can mean just after modernism. It can mean contra modernism, against modernism. There's that Oedipal relationship again. So you're going to see that tonight when we talk about the self. So one of the features of modernism is you've got to have a self, right? If you're going to turn inside and there's nothing, well, that's a whole different thing. It can be kind of cool, actually, but now you're talking about Buddhism maybe or something else. So while modernism strips away history or turns away from it, what's left from that is the self. And so modernism, especially in literature, and in art, is about the exploration of this self. Postmodernism, as you're going to see, does not allow for a self, or at least not the kind of self you're used to. Equivalent to late capitalism, so it's a Marxist, Hegelian kind of understanding of, okay, postmodernism is about capitalism taking over, dominating our psyches and our planet. That's postmodernism. And again, that's Frederick Jameson. Sometimes it's just after modernism historically. So we were modernists with Descartes and up to the war, Second World War, and now we're postmodern. So it's just a historical era. That's not that useful, actually. Where postmodernism really began was as a style. And we're going to talk about this in terms of architecture. It begins as a style, not a philosophy. We'll talk about the philosophy of postmodernism, which is post-structuralism. And that's a very different thing. And yes, I'm going to inflict post-structuralism on you tonight so you can understand the philosophy underlying postmodernism, underlying this approach to style. And this style is, as I said, it's pastiche, it's hybrid forms and genres. It combines high and low cultures. It mixes different cultures or time periods. It dehistoricizes, rehistoricizes. And it does it all across the arts, architecture, visual arts, film, photography. For example, you may know John Cage's famous piece, The Composer, is 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It's his most famous piece. It's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. Except it's really not. People put it that way, and I understand why they do, but what Cage wanted to do was just have 4 minutes and 33 seconds of ambient sound. And that was his composition. What did he do? He cleared out the space, the acoustical space, for that to happen, for that to emerge. Lots more. Sometimes postmodernism gets depicted as this globalization kind of thing where technology has brought people together and we're now conversing with people all over the planet, and it's kind of a mass communication phenomenon. Again, I don't see it used that much. I see it used mostly in terms of philosophy and artistic style. And that's what gets confused. So philosophy is going to say that what we have is a postmodern condition. It's simply describing where we are. Artists and art are going to advocate a postmodern position, meaning like the architect who did the building in New Orleans, he redid a classical building and it was all classical architecture except for the columns, which he did in neon. I forget who it was, I'm sorry. So it's like we're going to re-engage history, but we're also going to do it playfully, and that's putting something out into the world. That's not just describing the condition we're in. That's putting something out in the world that says, hey, look at the condition we're in, right? All right. Postmodern philosophy really is drawn from Friedrich Nietzsche. And in fact, a little essay, it's a very short essay, called On Truth and Lie in the Extramoral Sense. On Truth and Lie in the Extramoral Sense. And let me just give you a sense of what he says here. It's really quite beautiful. In some remote corner of the universe, poured out and glittering in innumerable solar systems, there once was a star on which clever animals had invented knowledge. That was the highest and most mendacious minute of world history. He puts world history in quotation marks. Yet only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star grew cold, and the clever animals had to die. Welcome to Nietzsche, by the way. I probably should have warned you. One might invent such a fable and still not have illustrated sufficiently how wretched, how shadowy and flighty, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect appears in nature. There have been eternities when it did not exist, and when it is done again, nothing will have happened. For this intellect has no further mission that would lead beyond human life. It is human, rather, and only its owner and producer give it such importance, as if the world pivoted around it. But if we could communicate with the mosquito, then we would learn that he floats through the air with the same self-importance, feeling within itself the flying center of the world. There's nothing in nature so despicable or insignificant that it cannot immediately be blown up like a bag by a slight breath of this power of knowledge. And just as every porter wants an admirer, the proudest human being, the philosopher, thinks that he sees on the eyes of the universe telescopically focused from all sides on his own actions and thoughts. What then is truth? Nietzsche says. A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten what they are. Metaphors, which are worn out and without sensuous power. Coins, which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. So it goes back to the 19th century. It goes up to the early 20th century with a Swiss linguist who never wrote a book, but his students wrote down the notes from his classes, and so it comes to us as the course in general linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure. Now, stay with me here. I'm not going to torture you too much, but you do need to understand this to understand postmodernism. So, Saussure was a structuralist, meaning he was interested in the structural study of language. What's the structural study of language? Well, it's different from the study of language as it had been up until that time, which was about what Wittgenstein called the picture theory of language that goes back to Augustine and Plato. And we already heard it. We heard it in the description of the Enlightenment. Words must be connected to things. Saussure says, well, I don't actually see language working that way. So you have to understand the terminology a little bit. A sign, on the left there, is the signifier and the signified. The signifier is the material element of the sign. It may be written down, it may be printed, it may be spoken. That's the materiality of the signifier. The signified is the mental image that comes into your mind when the signifier is spoken or written. So the sign is the combination of a material element and a mental element. Now, of course, philosophy of language and linguistics before this was not so concerned with this. They were concerned with the referent, the annoying four-legged creature that uses a litter box and stares at you superiorly, as if imperially. Saussure says language never gets to the referent. Why? Two reasons. Because the sign is arbitrary and unmotivated. And the arbitrariness can be seen there right beside the signifier, is that you can use any signifier, almost any signifier theoretically, and practically you can use dozens of signifiers to refer to the same reference. If you can use dozens of signifiers, that is different signs, to refer to the same referent, how are these signs connected to the thing? How is cat connected to the annoying litter box using creature? Well, Saussure says it's not, and it never has been. So if we want to understand language, better cut off the referent because it's not there. And he's right. There's no cat on the page, of course, in general linguistics. But the word cat is everywhere. There's no cat there. There's only the sign of cat. As he says here, nearly all institutions are based on signs, but these signs do not evoke things. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means a lot. It means more than Saussure realized, in fact, because what comes along after that is post-structuralism, namely through Jacques Derrida, French philosopher, who says, you know what? You're right, Saussure. There is no referent in the system. guess what? There's also no signified. There are only signs. So structuralism cuts off the sign from the referent. Post-structuralism cuts off the signifier from the signified, or the signified from the signifier. So we are now awash in signifiers. And I know. Give me 1 second, Charlie. I know. When I teach this in a classroom, there used to be these things called dictionaries they were books, and I had one, and I would take it to class on post-structuralism day, and I would hand it to a student, and I'd say, tell me what the word trust is. What is trust? And she would invariably turn to the T's, and she would go to trust, and she'd begin reading the definition. I would say, oh, I'm sorry, trust is a faith? What is faith? And she would flip to faith, and she would begin reading, and I'd say, oh, I'm sorry, what is that? That's post-structuralism. And Derrida called it différence, or difference, because language works through the difference between the signs and the signifiers in Derrida's sense. But it also is deferring, right? So just as you try to find the meaning in the dictionary, it keeps being deferred. So he used the French love to play on words, so it's différence and difference. All right? Meaning, you never get to meaning. Charlie. Meaning, you never get to meaning. Now, we can argue whether that's true or not. It is. But I don't want to get hung up on that right now, because I think you can probably already see how postmodernism, as an artistic device, strategy, but also as a condition, comes from post-structuralism, or is connected to, derives from post-structuralism. Another post-structuralist thinker besides Derrida, there are a lot of them, but another one I love is Jean Baudrillard. And does anybody know why I have the matrix up?
Based on that, they gave it to Keanu Reeves to read before he started acting as Neo.
Emily for the win. If you didn't hear her, they gave Keanu Reeves, Jean Baudrillard's book, Simulacra and Simulation, to read in order to become Neo. The book is based on a French academic's theory of hyperreality. What he says, Baudrillard in the opening, I love it, because he uses a Borges tale of these cartographers who try to make the perfect map. And if you know Borges, you know this is right in his wheelhouse. He loves this kind of philosophical literature, writing it, I mean. And so they get together and they say, well, okay, here's a map of the territory. And they're like, well, but you can't see this, and wouldn't it be better if it were a little bigger? Yep. Well, yeah. Oh, now I can see that, but where's that other thing? That valley? Where's that little river? Well, let's make it bigger. You see where this is going, right? Eventually, the map covers the territory, because if you want to make the perfect map, it's got to cover the territory. And in the Borges tale, he speaks of travelers long in the future who may come across little tatters of the map and wonder what it is underneath. Well, for Baudrillard, what it is underneath is reality, or was reality, that has been covered over by signs, or a collection of signs so woven together that you see no space between them. And so it becomes a simulacrum. A simulacrum. It becomes the matrix. And the epigram to simulacra and simulation is this: the simulacrum is never that which conceals the truth. It is the truth which conceals that there is none. The simulacrum is true. Ecclesiastes. It's not Ecclesiastes, by the way. But notice what he did there. Many people who read that or hear that will not know that that's not Ecclesiastes. And so they think it's coming from the Bible, that the Bible speaks of simulacrum. But on the other hand, it kind of does. It kind of does, especially in Ecclesiastes. Listen to Baudrillard here. This is fascinating. See if this resonates with your life in 20th century, 21st century America or anywhere. When the real is no longer what it used to be, nostalgia assumes its full meaning. There's a proliferation of myths of origin and signs of reality. So as you lose reality, more signs of reality appear, but they're signs of secondhand truth, of objectivity and authenticity. He wrote this before Twitter, by the way. There's an escalation of the true, of lived experience, reality television. A resurrection of the figurative where the object and substance have disappeared, and there's a panic-stricken production of the real and the referential above and parallel to the panic of material production. You have to keep generating the real once you realize it's gone. This is how simulation appears in the phase that concerns us, a strategy of the real, the neo-real, the hyper-real, whose universal double is a strategy of deterrence. He continues, representation has become reality. The signifier has replaced the signified, and there is nothing else, no thing elsewhere, no thing outside the text. He's quoting Derrida, Jacques Derrida, who said, there is no outside text. In fact, as time goes on, the map will deteriorate and fall into the territory, but there will be no way to distinguish the two. And in fact, there never was. And of course, he loves writing about Disneyland. I'll leave that for you, just give you a little quote. Disneyland exists in order to hide that it itself is real. All of real America, that is Disneyland, Disneyland is presented as an imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, whereas all of Los Angeles and America that surrounds it are no longer real. Disneyland is the simulacrum. It has replaced reality. It is the map that has overgrown the territory. These belong to the hyper-real order and to the order of simulation. It is no longer a question of a false representation of reality, but of concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, and thus saving the reality principle. All right, what does all this have to do with who we are, the stages along life's way of our self? Well, interestingly, we're kind of right back to Carl Jung. We have a fluid self. We have many selves, in fact. And a lot of postmodernist psychologists, in fact, really like a book I mentioned before, Irving Goffman's 1953, something like that, The Presentation of the Self in Everyday Life, where he used dramaturgy. He used the study of drama as the basis for psychology, meaning we're playing many roles. I'm playing a role right now. So are you. You're playing a role, and your role is defined, circumscribed, constitutive of your context. And so, I'm giving a lecture right now. If I were at my house, that would not be well received for me to stand up and give a lecture, because that's the wrong self. And sometimes that gets pointed out to me, by the way. That's the wrong self. I don't want to hear this self right now. Interestingly, and where's Lauren? Lauren mentioned this a few weeks ago. There is a self in the postmodern condition, but like everything else, it is linguistic. when you say I. When you say I, that's an interesting sign, because it doesn't really refer to anything. In the old paradigm, you would think it refers back to you, but in the postmodern world, linguistic world, I is a kind of interruption in the simulacrum. That doesn't mean there is a self, but it means you're doing something interesting in the semiotics of what's happening. You might look at, if you're interested in this, I doubt anybody's interested in it, but if you're interested in this, there's a great book called The Subject of Semiotics by Kaja Silverman. It is also a consuming self. So, let me see if I can find the quotation here. Yeah. The culture industry performs two main functions in terms of identity formation. It provides consumers with explicit identity models, showing them how to be. And it provides consumers with the symbolic resources with which to reconstruct their identities. That may sound radical to you, but it's not. It's really not. You know, when I was a teenager, I loved the Eagles. But now, I like Beach House or War Paint. You see what I'm doing there? I'm constituting myself. I'm making myself a self, but within the simulacrum, within the system of signs, right? So the self is a constellation of responses to cultural stimuli. Tell me that's not true. Tell me that's... I look back, as I get older, I look back and I think, you know, every damn thing I've ever said is a version or an actual quotation from a movie. I swear to God that's true. And I'm like, who am I? I'm being serious. I think of some of the most significant moments in my life, and I'm like, that's a line from The West Wing. And it's right, and so, but it was so meaningful. And it was so right for the moment. This is also important for intersectionality. You may have heard about this, where this is kind of, I don't even know if it's a wave of feminism, but it's a development of feminism that says, hey, we shouldn't just be looking at gender, we should be looking at gender, race, class, everything. And that may sound obvious, but it has not been obvious. It has not been, in fact, the practice, especially since first wave, but up through second wave feminism. All right, I'm going to close up here because I know you want to get in here and tell me I'm wrong. Charles Jenks, I love this in terms of architecture. Remember, or I don't know if I said it yet, the term postmodern first gets used in relation to architecture as this stylistic approach by Charles Jenks. And he says, modern architecture died in St. Louis, Missouri on July 15th, 1972 at 3:32 p.m. or thereabouts. And there's a beautiful Guardian article that I just want to read to you about this because it's so perfect. This is the Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis. And you can tell, even from that poor picture, that it's like a modern monstrosity. Like, this is modernism, right? Just blocks. The architect of the project was Minoru Yamasaki, who designed the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, and might be considered unlucky in the amount of violence done to his works. Yamasaki professed humanity, harmony, and his opposition to prejudice, beliefs born of his experiences as a put-upon Japanese American. He laid out Pruitt-Igoe according to the best principles of the modern movement, an orderly plan in which the cars and pedestrians were separated, ample open space was provided between the blocks, and flats were oriented to catch daylight and views. By the time they were destroyed, these blocks were notorious for violence, vandalism, chaos, and squalor. Police and firemen refused to go there, as missiles would be hurled at them from high levels if they did. If Yamasaki and other modernists believed that rational architecture could make people behave better, Pruitt-Igoe seems to prove the opposite. So in Jink's words, it was finally put out of its misery, boom, boom, boom. It was obvious, this is still from the Guardian article, it became a certitude of the age that some silly architects had a fantasy which turned into its opposite, and appropriate measures were taken. But as with many certitudes, the truth now seems not quite so simple. Robert Venturi, in Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, says, I speak of a complex, contradictory architecture. He's calling for a postmodern architecture, based on the richness and ambiguity of modern experience, including that experience which is inherent in art. I welcome the problems and exploit the uncertainties. I like elements which are hybrid rather than pure, compromising rather than clean, accommodating rather than excluding. I am for messy vitality over obvious unity. I prefer both and to either or, black and white and sometimes gray to black and white. An architecture of complexity and contradiction must embody the difficult unity of inclusion rather than the easy unity of exclusion. Welcome to postmodernism. That is a beautiful statement of postmodernism. Of course, that's our own Frank Gehry's Disney concert hall there, which I'm not sure I would call postmodern, but I wanted to give you something that you would recognize. All right. Finally, posthumanism, which is postmodernism, I think. And if you don't want to get into the posts and the hyphens, that's fine. It's just where we are now. I don't know if you know about this, but this is fascinating. It's basically, posthumanism is a movement, a philosophical movement, an intellectual movement that asks us to imagine, because we must, what a human will be with posthuman capacity in terms of health, cognition, and emotion especially. Health, cognition, and emotion. You know, there's some biologist in England who's utterly convinced we can live forever. I don't know if you heard this guy. He looks totally whacked out, and I love him because he looks like the guy who would create eternal life. And he says, basically, we die because of inflammation. If we can stop inflammation, we'll live forever. Thank you, Aubrey de Grey. Excellent. So, let me give you a quote from J. David Bolter from Georgia Tech. The term posthumanism is applied to a range of contemporary theoretical positions put forward by researchers with disciplinary backgrounds in philosophy, science, and technology studies, all the others. For these groups, posthumanism designates a series of breaks. This is the important line. It designates a series of breaks with foundational assumptions of modern Western culture. In particular, a new way of understanding the human subject in relation to the natural world, but also to the virtual world. Posthumanist theory claims to offer a new epistemology that is not anthropocentric. Posthumanist theory claims to offer a new epistemology, a new theory of knowledge, that is not centered on us, and therefore not centered in Cartesian dualism, the mind-body problem of cogito ergo sum. It seeks to undermine the traditional boundaries between the human, the animal, and the technological. And then, to better explain it,
the world is run by computers. The world is run by robots. And sometimes they ask us if we're a robot. Just because we're trying to log on and look at our own stuff. Multiple times a day. May I see my stuff, please? I smell a robot. Prove you're not a robot. Look at these curvy letters. Much curvier than most letters, wouldn't you say? Robot could ever read these. You look mortal if ye be. You look. And you type what you think you see. Is it an E or is it a 3? That's up to ye. these pictures. He's not kind of straps on him. You spend a lot of your day telling a robot that you're not a robot. And think about that for 2 minutes and tell me you don't want to walk into the ocean.
You don't get to choose postmodernism. It has already chosen you. And I'm fine with that. I like it. I think it's the Western way to wisdom. And if you think I'm crazy, that's okay. That's a part of the postmodern condition too. But there are examples out there. There is, for example, this amazing novel from 1982, by Don DeLillo called White Noise. And it is a statement of what religion looks like in the postmodern and even posthuman era. Let me give you a sense of it. This is one of the most famous scenes in the novel about the most photographed barn in America. We drove 22 miles into the country around Farmington. There were meadows and apple orchards. White fences trailed through the rolling fields. Soon the signs started appearing, "The most photographed barn in America." We counted 5 signs before we reached the site. There were 40 cars and a tour bus in the makeshift lot. We walked along a cow path to the slightly elevated spot set aside for viewing and photographing. All the people had cameras. Some had tripods, telephoto lenses, filter kits. A man in the booth sold postcards and slides, pictures of the barn taken from an elevated spot. We stood near a grove of trees and watched the photographers. Murray maintained a prolonged silence, occasionally scrawling some notes in a little book. "No one sees the barn," he finally said. A long silence followed. "Once you've seen the signs about the barn, it becomes impossible to see the barn." He fell silent once more. People with cameras left the elevated site, replaced by others. "We're not here to capture an image. We're here to maintain one. Every photograph reinforces the aura. Can you feel it, Jack? An accumulation of nameless energies." There was an extended silence. The man in the booth sold postcards and slides. "Being here is a kind of spiritual surrender. We see only what the others see. Thousands who were here in the past, those who will come in the future. We've agreed to be part of a collective perception. It literally colors our vision, a religious experience in a way, like all tourism." Another silence ensued. "They are taking pictures of taking pictures," he said. And then finally, I have to give you this scene. So there's something called the ATE, the Airborne Toxic Event, that happens in their little New England town, and the town has to be evacuated. And Jack, who's the protagonist, he's a professor of Hitler studies at the college on the hill, it's called. He takes his family, and his family is everything. This is an American family story as much as anything. And he goes in search of his daughter, Steffi. And, it's a traumatic event. People being evacuated, they're sleeping on the ground. He's going to check on his children. And he finds them. A random tumble of heads and dangled limbs. In those soft, warm faces was a quality of trust, so absolute and pure that I did not want to think it might be misplaced. There must be something somewhere large and grand and redoubtable enough to justify this shining reliance and implicit belief. A feeling of desperate piety swept over me. It was cosmic in nature, full of yearnings and teachings. It spoke of vast distances, awesome but subtle forces. These sleeping children were like figures for the Rosicrucians, drawing a powerful beam of light from somewhere off the page. Steffi turned slightly, then muttered something in her sleep. It seemed important that I know what it was. In my current state, bearing the death impression of the Naiadine cloud, I was ready to search anywhere for signs and hints, intimations of odd comfort. I pulled up my chair closer. Her face in pouchy sleep might have been a structure designed solely to protect the eyes, those great, large, and apprehensive things, prone to color phases and a darting alertness, to a perception of distress in others. I sat there watching her. Moments later, she spoke again. Distinct syllables this time, not some dreamy murmur, but a language not quite of this world. I struggled to understand. I was convinced she was saying something, fitting together units of stable meaning. I watched her face, waited. 10 minutes passed. She uttered 2 clearly audible words, familiar and elusive at the same time, words that seemed to have a ritual meaning, a part of a verbal spell or ecstatic chant. Toyota Celica. A long moment passed before I realized this was the name of an automobile. The truth only amazed me more. The utterance was beautiful and mysterious, gold shot with looming wonder. It was like the name of an ancient power in the sky, tablet carved in cuneiform. It made me feel that something hovered. But how could this be? A simple brand name, an ordinary car. How could these near-nonsense words, murmured in a child's restless sleep, make me sense a meaning, a presence? She was only repeating some TV voice, Toyota Corolla, Toyota Celica, Toyota Cressida, supranational names, computer-generated, more or less universally pronounceable, part of every child's brain noise, substatic regions too deep to probe. Whatever its source, the utterance struck me with the impact of a moment of splendid transcendence. Thank you for your attention.